Hello, good evening and welcome to the IEA's YouTube channel. I'm Emma Revel, Head of Public Affairs at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and you're watching a Union Showdown. Before we get started, just a reminder that we're posting great content on YouTube every single day, and if you click the subscribe button, you can join the 10,000 other subscribers who never miss an update. Here at the IEA, we love a good debate, so much so we often don't need to leave the office to find one. You might have seen the great lockdown showdown between our head of lifestyle economics, Christopher Snowdon, and our head of regulatory affairs, Victoria Hewson, on whether a third national lockdown was justified, and tonight we're back for a second round. This evening, I'm joined by Marc Glendening, our head of cultural affairs, and the head honcho himself, Director General Marc Littlewood, to ask whether classical liberals should support independence movements, both at home and abroad, or should we be leaning towards collective strength? Is the future of England, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales a slightly mismatched foursome, or should we go our separate ways? We're going to start, as always, with the 5-minute elevator pitch from each corner. Our two debaters, quite unhelpfully from a chair's perspective, have the same first names, so we're sticking to public school rules, surnames only. Glendening is going out to bat first for Team UK, followed by Littlewood and his pitch for independence if people want it. Just a reminder that we will be taking questions live on YouTube, so if you have any, you can stick them in the chat box at any time, and I will put them to our guests. But first, opening comments from Marc Glendening.
Well, my comments this evening are going to have a schizophrenic quality. For the first 2 minutes, I will be speaking as myself, a national liberal, but then I'm going to transition to becoming a Scottish politically non-binary voter who is neither a dyed-in-the-wool red, white and blue Glasgow Rangers supporter nor a Celtic-supporting Scottish nationalist on dogmatic principle. I will be asking myself two questions which I will then attempt to answer in my new persona, and highly observant and cynical viewers will have detected that there is a possibility of a conflict of interest here in this semantical device I am employing this evening. Of course, there's no necessary reason why a liberal should support the continuation, the survival of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. There's a necessary tension between a classical liberal ideal of an individualistic society, a society in which individuals are naturally believed to be free. And so their freedom is not the gift of the state.
Sorry, Marc, I just need to cut in. Apparently we're having some very bad technical issues. So instead, I'm going to ask Marc Littlewood to give his opening comments, and hopefully we can sort out Glendening's mind while we're at it. Marc Littlewood, hopefully you can jump in.
Okay, well, let's hope that the technical issues here aren't as bad as the technical issues at 2 Lord North Street. So Marc will have to be schizophrenic in a few minutes' time. There's 3 quick points I think I want to make about it. And to be clear, I'm not a staunch advocate of Scottish independence. Emma, you summed up my views quite well, that Scotland can go independent if they want to. I think it's the sort of thing that we basically shouldn't panic about. But I'm not going to present to you a case that it is an overarching United Kingdom priority to split up the Union, or that it would necessarily be the obvious and best choice for the Scots. I'm just saying we shouldn't panic about it, and self-determination is a good way to go. And I suppose there were 3 points I would make. The first is it right or appropriate to ask the Scottish people, do they have the right to exercise self-determination and have a second referendum, a second bite at the cherry, amiss 7 years after they last had a patch. If it's right to ask, is an independent Scotland in any way viable? Or is this sort of ludicrous theoretical concept, a bit like me declaring independence here in my flat in Clapham, clearly preposterous? Is Scotland actually viable? But even if it's viable, would it be remotely sensible? Or could the economic consequences be disastrous? So let's start with the right to ask. It is true that in the last referendum, this was portrayed as a once-in-a-generation decision, and it is true that 7 years does not amount to a generation. However, look at the small print, or I would say the fairly large print, which was a second referendum, in my view, is wholly justified. And this was said at the time, if the constitutional circumstances radically change. And I would argue that they have radically changed, not least because Brexit is now a reality rather than a prospect, something which the Scots voted heavily against. And clearly the choice that Scots voters faced in 2014 was that if you wished to remain in the European Union, you had to vote to stay in the United Kingdom. So if you're a Scottish voter whose overarching priority or something weighing heavily with you was to stay in the EU, then you had to stay in the UK. And I guess the flip side is also true. If your overarching priority was to get out of the EU as soon as possible, I guess you had to vote to leave the UK. That's clearly altered. Similarly, it's fair to say that the Scottish National Party, who advocate independence in a second referendum, have fared well at the ballot box since. I mean, I think perhaps a second referendum on Brexit across the United Kingdom might have been legitimate if, say, the Liberal Democrats or Change UK or whatever they were called won the last election overwhelmingly. There would have been a mandate for it. So I think we quite easily clear that it's right to ask again hurdle for those reasons. The Constitution's changed, and the Scottish people, through various votes they've cast for Holyrood and for Westminster, are continuing to heavily back the SNP. Second question, is it viable? Is this a kind of absolutely ludicrous pipe dream? And I would argue, no. I think an independent Scotland is entirely viable, and there should be no panic about this whatsoever, in the same way that I think the UK outside of the EU is wholly viable. Scotland's GDP is about 250 billion US dollars. It's measurably higher than New Zealand, an independent country. They about equal to the Czech Republic, about 12 billion or so more than Portugal, despite Portugal having almost twice the population of Scotland, $25 billion more than Peru. That has a population 6 times larger. Probably the nearest comparator to Scotland is Finland. Scotland's marginally smaller than Finland in GDP terms, but not much, and nobody suggests Finland can't be an independent country. GDP per capita, according to the Scottish government, is just north of £30,000 sterling a year, placing it 18th on the OECD's per capita table. Over the world as a whole, it's 29th, slightly above Japan, Italy, New Zealand, Korea, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel. Population size, about 5.5 million people. Country's population would be about equal to that of, I've already mentioned, Finland, Norway, Slovakia, Denmark. So completely viable. And I think not impossible to bring about. I don't want to hand wave away the administrative difficulties, but I think these are often overstated by people who support the constitutional status quo. I would argue that we have seen that with regard to Brexit, where we were sort of promised that the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and a plague of locusts would turn up the day we left, and news crews descended on Dover to see how catastrophic everything would be. Actually, it's gone relatively smoothly. That's not a reason for necessarily supporting Brexit, but it hasn't been a cataclysmic disaster. Administratively, I think rather dramatic constitutional change can be accommodated. Brexit is proof of that. But I would say if you go back a bit further, so is the breakup of the Soviet Union and independence movements in Central and Eastern Europe. I didn't look, Emma, at the history just before coming onto the show, but I think Czechoslovakia divided into the Czech Republic and Slovakia almost over the course of a long bank holiday weekend. Again, extraordinarily smoothly. So the viability threshold, in my mind, is quite comfortably cleared. They have a right to ask again. It's right to ask the Scottish people again, and it is not nonsensical in any way at all to imagine Scotland as an independent country. If that's the route they choose, that's a perfectly plausible destiny. Which then leads you to the sort of economic consequences, and whether it's wise. It might be okay to ask them. It might be a viable option, but it might be an extraordinarily stupid option. I find that a lot harder to judge, and I think people should be humble about judging that. Because you can look at the immediate spot price, Barnett formula, that sort of thing. and say, oh, Scotland would be worse off. This is the argument that the European Union uses for net contributors to stay in the EU. But it's nearly impossible to build in the dynamic effects. We don't know how an independent Scotland would behave. Would it continue on its present public policy path, which is, I guess you could say, measurably to the left of centre, certainly compared to the rest of the United Kingdom? Or would it rediscover the joys of Adam Smith? I think that's extremely difficult to predict, and therefore you need to make a theoretical judgment that are, broadly speaking, smaller governments closer to the people better. And I think that they broadly are. That if Scotland had not just the opportunity, but the responsibility of standing on its own 2 feet, you would almost certainly get better public policy for Scotland, rather than its present political debate being almost entirely about its relationship with Westminster and the UK and how it should interface with the UK. And to give you an example of that, I mean, I think a benefit of Brexit, it's not a completely clear-cut benefit, but I think it is a benefit, is the way that we have adopted a different regulatory approach to the rollout of the COVID vaccination programme. And we have done that enormously more successfully than the European Union because we've been able to diverge from the European Union. And I welcome that regulatory competition. I hope in the due course of time the European Union and the European Medical Agency learn from us because we've been a hell of a lot better than them. But you couldn't have predicted 3 years ago. I mean, clearly nobody at the time of the Brexit referendum said a very good reason to vote to leave the European Union is that if a pandemic comes along, we don't want to be hamstrung by the European Commission trying to purchase vaccines. That would be a disaster. People would have thought you were completely mad. They wouldn't have known what you were talking about. So the benefits are dynamic and are hard to predict. And I think, and are not certain, but I think you can apply a sensible classical liberal approach, which is basically smaller governments that are closer to the people tend to make wiser decisions. No further guarantees than that. So for all of those reasons, I think there should be a second referendum. Certainly if the SNP or other, probably alongside other nationalist allies like the Green Party, prevail in the Holyrood elections, I think that provides a mandate for a second referendum. One should go ahead. There's no question in my view that an independent Scotland is viable. And although the economic consequences are uncertain, there are good reasons to believe that smaller units make better decisions. So I'm less concerned, I would be less concerned as a Scot about the Barnett formula, for example, than the long-term future of Scotland as an independent country. And if Marc Glendening's technicals are sorted, I think I would just point out that a great irony for me about this, and I can't quite get my head around it, is that it seems a good number of the people who are arguing that really Scotland really should stay in the United Kingdom are using very similar arguments to the Remainers in the Brexit referendum campaign, despite the fact that they, by and large, the staunchest unionists as far as the UK is concerned, were on the Brexit side. But now I'm assuming that Marc Glendening and various others are going to roll out all of the stronger together, better standing together, the benefits of union and peace and security. And it's a real oddity to me that people apply those arguments rather differently to Scotland and to the UK's relationship in the European Union. So I would probably describe myself to some degree as a national liberal too, as Marc Glendening described himself. But I think that means that you give people the right to self-determination. And although you shouldn't push them in that direction, I think there are good reasons to believe that if people seize that opportunity, they become responsible, better policymakers as a result.
Okay, so an independent Scotland might be more responsible and better policymakers. We've spent considerably less than Downing Street's 2.7 million, but let's go back to the IEA studio and see if Marc Glendening's sound issues have been fixed. Marc, make your case.
Hello, hi. So I was saying that there's no necessary reason why a Liberal should support a continuation, a survival of the
Sorry,
United
Marc,
Kingdom.
I'm going to jump back in. We have still got an echo. Clearly, there is a gap between what our studio has achieved and what hopefully the Downing Street studio will have achieved when we get there. Who knows? It's not quite been used yet. Marc, I'll come back to you. Littlewood, apologies. We're just going to have to try and get Glendening set up on another computer. One thing I did want to ask is about the case for a second referendum. You know, Brexit has changed when it comes to Scottish independence. I agree that actually there's been a dramatic change in circumstance, and so a second referendum is valid. But it's not something that everyone subscribes to. You know, one of our other colleagues described herself as a coercive nationalist, a coercive unionist, in that, you know, you had your shot, and it was a once in a generation referendum. So do you think you would be able to persuade more people that actually the case for a second referendum is quite strong in Scotland's case?
Well, I mean, to my mind, it hinges on two things, as I said, Emma. The first thing it hinges on is whether or not there has been a change in circumstances. And I think the Scottish nationalists can credibly argue that there has. You know, Brexit changes the constitutional landscape. But that, if you like, isn't something to be tested in a court of law. This is, in essence, a political decision. So that it's sort of up to the Scottish people whether they find that a persuasive case for running it again. And because it's political, I think it's essentially an electoral outcome, right? I don't think there should be necessarily a bar on the number of referendums that you hold on a particular given issue. So, for example, if the Scottish people elect the let's hold yet another referendum party each and every time.
Which some would argue that's what the SNP are, after all.
Yeah, and fair enough. I mean, if you keep electing them, you will keep getting a referendum. Similarly, I would say, if you like, on the flip side, imagine that the United Kingdom had voted to stay in the European Union. But then Nigel Farage had won the successive general election on a platform to hold a second referendum. That legitimises the second referendum. Now, I know that in technical terms, Westminster need to grant this. It's not within the gift of Holyrood. And I would hope that we don't get into a kind of Spain versus Catalonia sort of situation in which, you know, the sort of informal referenda are attempted to be held. But it seems to me really rather continually in Scotland that the Scots seem minded to vote for another bite at the cherry. And I would say there's something also that places that, I mean, this is a general observation. I wouldn't say I've worked out a constitutional theory here about the constitutional status quo. I would say that the constitutional status quo should be revisited probably quite often if there is a very, very sizable minority who oppose the status quo. So I think that may well have happened in Brexit, for example. That, you know, let's imagine that it had been 52-48 the other way round. I think a case could be put that if you've got 48% of people who are still committed to leaving the European Union, you don't really have a constitutional settlement. And clearly in Scotland, there is a very sizable chunk of people who are dissatisfied with the constitutional settlement. Maybe not as many as half. I mean, I'm not saying the referendum would be won by the nationalists. It seems it would be quite close again. And the SNP, the principal cheerleaders, are obviously facing a large number of their own internal difficulties at the moment. But if you've got in a given area, I don't know what the number would be, 35, 40, 45, 48% of people who are devoutly opposed to the present constitutional settlement, then it seems to me likely that you will revisit that a lot. And similarly, we would in the UK. I mean, if it became clear that a very sizable number of people, 40% plus, were desperate to hold a second referendum and desperate to rejoin the European Union, and were expressing that desperation and that salience through the ballot box, there may well have been, or there may still in future be, a second referendum if people like Change UK and the Liberal Democrats do spectacularly well at the ballot box because the Remainers have decided that that's where their priorities lie. So I don't have a kind of cap on number of referendums, really. If people want them every year, I don't see why they shouldn't have them every year. I guess it's likely to be harder for the SNP to keep arguing, let's, you know, hold one a week until we win. But if they have the political support to do so and win elections on that platform, fine by me.
And I think it's probably fair to say the SNP do have that support. Right, third time's a charm. Marc Glendening, can we have your opening comments, please?
Yeah, well, I'm going to probably cut to the chase and address this question from my new persona as a Scottish voter, because obviously in the forthcoming elections in a few weeks' time, it's only Scots that matter. It doesn't really matter what Mr. Littlewood and myself or anybody else south of the border thinks. But in answering these two questions, there is a context that has to be addressed, I think, in order to have a meaningful discussion about this. First of all, we have to assume that if Scotland votes to leave the United Kingdom, it will attempt to rejoin the European Union, and will probably do so because the SNP leadership, if not all of their actual voters, support this. And we also have to assume that the SNP are going to be in power for the next 20 years at least, albeit sometimes in alliance with other left-wing political parties north of the border. So bearing that in mind, I, as a Scottish voter, will have to address two key questions. Will Scotland's economic position significantly improve or decline if it breaks away? And so therefore, there are a series of subsidiary questions that need to be addressed. For example, the Scottish deficit at the moment is 7% of national income. If they're going to get into the EU, they're going to have to cut this down to 3% because of the stability rules. And so who's going to actually pay for that? Is this going to result in an increase in taxation? Is it going to mean significant cuts in public services, or a combination of the two? I, as a Scottish voter, I want to get some sort of idea as to what's going to happen. Then there's the question, if Scotland does join the EU, then there will have to be a hard border with England and the rest of the remaining UK. At the moment, about 60% of Scottish exports go into the British market, about 23% go to the non-EU world, and only 17% actually make their way into the European Union. So because of that 17%, Scotland is going to have a hard border with the UK. Then, of course, there's the perennial question of what is the currency going to be. It's quite clear that the SNP ultimately do want to join the euro. Now, this is something that only 7% of Scots in a recent opinion poll thought was a good idea, but it's a necessary condition nowadays if you want to join the EU to commit to signing up for the euro. So the SNP is not being clear with the Scottish people about this. And lastly, of course, there's the issue of the Barnett formula. Again, at the moment, Scotland has its cake and eat it because of the block grant. But who is going to pay for the ending of the block grant? That is something I, as a Scottish voter, would need to know before I cast my vote. And then the last couple of questions I would ask relate to democracy. If I'm a naturally left of centre voter, I might look forward to the idea of collectivist government forevermore under left-wing political parties. But if I am somebody who is Tory inclined, or somebody who is open-minded about economic policy, then the prospect of never again living under centre-right government is something that I would see as being a factor reducing my democratic capacity impact on the political system. Then there's the question of whether the SNP will become more sinister and authoritarian if they become a party that effectively cannot be removed from office. We've seen only last week they passed a new hate crime bill, which actually criminalises potentially private conversations. We've seen the whole circus around the salmon sturgeon issue. It's clear that people within the Scottish Government were trying to influence the criminal justice system. So is that sort of trend going to continue or become worse if the SNP are effectively a political party that cannot be removed from office? And the last point I'll make is that if Scotland does rejoin the EU, it'll only have 2% of the votes in the Council of Ministers and within the European Parliament. It will have negligible political influence, given especially the reality that the European Union is going to acquire more and more law-making powers in the decades to come, which will have a major impact, obviously, upon the quality of democracy in Scotland. At the moment, the Scots have about 10% of the seats in Parliament, and they are disproportionately influential within the affairs of the United Kingdom. Until only recently, of course, we had a Scottish Prime Minister, and nobody south of the border thought that was in any way illegitimate. Gordon Brown wasn't judged on being a Scottish politician. He was judged in terms of his own record. So in conclusion, were I a Scottish person, and somebody who wasn't dogmatically committed either to the Union or to the idea of a Scotland outside of the UK, I would say simply on a pragmatic, if not an especially liberal basis, I would support the status quo.
Thanks very much. We got there in the end. Glendening, will stick with you because I was able to ask Littlewood about the case for a second referendum in Scotland. So I wanted to ask you what you thought. Victoria on YouTube has made a very good point. She says, is it possible to defend rolling referendums when only one side has to win? So Glendening, what do you think about the case for a second referendum? I mean, Littlewood's made a good point that, you know, Brexit has changed the rules of the game effectively for Scotland.
I agree with Littlewood on this one. It seems to me that if you accept the principle that no parliament can bind its successor, then if a political party or coalition of parties that explicitly campaign on the idea of trying to reverse a referendum that's just happened gain a majority of the seats, and I think in particular in this case, a majority of the votes collectively, then they have every right to impose a second referendum. But let us not forget that at the last general election, the Unionist parties in Scotland got 55% of the vote, exactly the same as in the referendum. So nothing actually has really changed, it seems to me. Now, let's see what happens in May. But if the SNP, together with the Greens, who I think are also campaigning on the basis of a referendum and a desire to leave the United Kingdom, if they win an absolute majority of the votes, not just the seats, then it seems to me Boris should drop any opposition to them having a second referendum.
Thanks very much. Don't forget, if you're watching us live on YouTube, you can stick your questions in the YouTube chat function, and I'll try and put as many to the marks as I possibly can. Littlewood, it feels very weird using surnames, I apologise. We are, after all, the Institute of Economic Affairs. If we look specifically at Scotland, you touched on this in your opening comments, but do you think an independent Scotland can survive financially? And I know you've made the case in the past that actually an independent Scotland could be a bit less socialist, and for free marketeers that might be a good thing. Independence might push them to a bit more fiscal responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, unlike Marc, the other Marc, I don't believe I have the foresight to predict the election results in Scotland over the next 20 years, although he says with apparent the same sort of level of certainty that George Osborne told us that the household income in the UK would be exactly, was it £3,212 lower by 2030. Marc Glendening's crystal ball gazing skills seem to be at least up to those of George Osborne and the Remain campaign, although he hesitated at the end by saying he doesn't know what's exactly going to happen in May. He seems absolutely confident that the Scottish National Party will continue to win election after election for the next 20 years. I mean, quite some prediction, I would say. If you had said 20 years ago that we would have already been through the Donald Trump presidency, that Britain would have voted for Brexit in a referendum and it would have been carried out, this would have been considered fantasy. So my point is that I think there needs to be some humility on predicting the future. Nevertheless, that said, I think there are good underlying reasons to believe, for some of the reasons that Glendening's put on the table, that an urgent approach to fiscal responsibility would have to be addressed by the Scots. I mean, he's also made a huge string of other presumptions that they definitely will apply to join the European Union, that the European Union will definitely enforce on them membership of the euro. That hasn't happened in Sweden, and in Sweden, for example, who are also in the waiting room, or with other EU member states. So we don't know. I mean, there is huge uncertainty. But so I think it comes down to a sort of a feeling in your bones about whether independent countries, who are then wholly responsible for what goes right or wrong in that particular realm, are likely to make responsible decisions rather than irresponsible decisions. And I think the general trend is that they would make more responsible decisions. And if they started making barking mad decisions that led to the tanking of the economy and whatever, the massive devaluation of their currency, if an SNP government did that, I feel extremely confident that they wouldn't last the 20 years which Marc Glendening, with a sort of wave of the hand, has already granted them. They would be displaced from office really quite quickly. So it's to my mind, this smacks of trying to protect the people from themselves. And if you think that they can exercise sensible decisions in the ballot box, then bad governments will be replaced, perhaps not immediately. I think one of the problems you've got in Scotland at the moment is this constitutional issue is a running sore. So you might very well be voting for the Scottish National Party in the Holyrood elections in May, even if you heartily disapprove of their record in government, just because you feel so passionately that you want to get a second referendum. But once that's all dealt with, then there's a reboot to normal. And if you're then dissatisfied with the shenanigans around sturgeon and salmon, or you don't like the way they're running the economy, or you don't like the hate crimes bill or whatever else, vote for a different party. It may well be the case that the Scottish National Party doesn't survive independence. It would have been mission accomplished. I mean, a number of the people involved in it will still be senior Scottish politicians, but it could go the way of UKIP or the Brexit Party. Once it's mission accomplished, you could get a very big political realignment. So I hesitate. I don't have Marc Glendening's brilliant foresight to predict exactly what will happen in elections over the next 20 years. Neither did I have the foresight to predict what was going to happen in elections in the previous 20 years. But I have a faith that by and large, the people would exercise responsibility at the ballot box. Scotland would continue to be a democracy if it was independent, and bad governments would be kicked out.
I mean, how much do you think then you need to look at the impact, not just on the country that wants to be independent, but the space that it's leaving? I mean, it seems like a ridiculous suggestion, but does England and English people who live in England have any say in this? You know, the United Kingdom has a lot of emotional resonance attached to it. A lot of people are very proud to say that they are British, not English or Scottish or what have you. Do you think, Glendening, that that's something that's overlooked, actually? You know, the case for what Britain and the United Kingdom can achieve together is a case that's not made enough, and perhaps if it were made a little bit more, there wouldn't be quite so much talk about Scottish independence?
I certainly don't believe that we, the good folk of Ulster and Wales, have any right to try and prevent the Scots leaving, any more than if, say, in Cornwall or Yorkshire or London, there was a great desire to leave the Union, and a democratic majority were to emerge in those places demanding a referendum, that the Scots and the other parts of the UK around those particular areas would have any right to block their self-determination. All this, of course, comes down ultimately to whether the United Kingdom is a demos, and is still a demos. And that is to say, a extended community of people who see the political institutions of the United Kingdom and their devolved entities or offshoots as legitimate. At the moment, clearly, the vast majority of British people do believe that they are part of a single political community. But that is, as I was trying to say at the beginning, is entirely contingent. This is not, decreed by some supernatural force. There are clearly strong minorities in Northern Ireland and Scotland that at the moment do not want to be part of a British demos. But a majority in those places, it appears anyway for the time being, still do. And I would argue, as an emotional British liberal nationalist, that the demos that exists in Britain is in large part due to the collective journey we all undertook at the time of the Reformation. I think this really does explain British exceptionalism and the small L political liberal trajectory of this country from that point. And of course, the Scots are a huge part of that, particularly if you look at the Scottish Enlightenment and its influence over the intellectual and political development of this country. So I would be very disappointed, emotionally triggered, were the Scots to vote to leave. I hope it doesn't happen. I'm a passionate, instinctive, emotional unionist. But of course, this is not my decision as somebody living in England.
Littlewood, in the previous comments, you described this as a running sore, the issue that it won't go away. The SNP are always going to fight for it, and while the SNP keep being elected, the issue is going to keep coming up. Do you agree with Marc that actually, he says, he's very passionate making the emotional case for the United Kingdom to stay? Do you think that's something that actually the rest of the UK doesn't talk enough about? Do you think we just focus on Scottish independence and not making the other side?
No, I think we talk about it too much. I find.
Well, we'll just end the show. We'll end the show now then if we talk about it.
I find Marc's. The emotional side of it. I just find this a bit bizarre. Especially for classical liberals to identify themselves through whatever the present prevailing state and constitutional structures are. I mean, I just don't identify myself in that sort of way. I will be Marc Littlewood with my various identity, whether Scotland stays or goes. I just find it extraordinary that anybody who purports to be a liberal of any stripe would say, the important thing for me, how I really identify myself, is that the select committee system in the Houses of Parliament has on it a certain number of Scottish MPs. This is actually sort of fundamental part of my own personal identity. It's not, it's a construction of the state. And I think what people feel about, whether they're, say, Cornish or a Yorkshireman or a Londoner or whatever, we should divorce that from the constitutional structures and the state structures that we live under. So, I mean, I'm just completely relaxed about it. Of course, there are a number of cultural institutions. I support the England football team. But I just find it extraordinary that people identify through it. I mean, I found it completely ridiculous that both Remainers and Brexiteers seem to find some identity through the colour of their bloody passport. I mean, this is a legal status document that you're issued with for the entire practical purposes of getting through a bloody airport. The fact that would be part of anybody's identity, but that both sides are, oh, God, I want the old British blue or black one back, is absolutely fundamental to me. Or the Remainers, blimey, no, I mean, I'm woeful. I really don't want one of those new blue ones. I want the burgundy one with EU written on the top. Completely ludicrous, in my view. So I think we should divorce the two. Emma, your question was, should the English have a say in this? And I think this is probably an area where Glendening and myself agree. I think that the specific answer to that is no. This is like a decision to get divorced. It doesn't need to be mutual. One part of the equation can choose to walk out, right? If the wife wishes to walk away, the husband can't veto it, and vice versa. Of course, England has the right to leave the United Kingdom if it chooses. And there are a number of people who, I'm not sure it's English independence as such, but have tried to rally to the flag of English Home Rule or an English Parliament, because, of course, our present constitutional settlement is not symmetrical. London has an assembly and Scotland has a parliament, but if you live in Hampshire, you've got a county council. I mean, it's a bit weird. But as it happens, pleas to those sort of constitutional change to the English voters just have fallen on stony ground. So the English don't care about it. The English National Party or the English Democrats or whatever form they take just don't have any traction. So the English don't seem to mind particularly, would be my read of election results and polls. So they have the right to mind if they want to. England could leave the UK, but we don't have the right to stop any of the other constituent parts getting divorced from us if they wish to.
A recent poll for ITV Wales showed that support for independence in Wales is growing, although it's worth pointing out support is actually quite significantly lower than support for the status quo. At what point, Marc Littlewood, do you think you would need independence to get in terms of popularity for you to start saying, okay, this is something we need to look at? You said in your introductory comments, there's no point in you declaring an independent state in Clapham, for example. But if the residents of Clapham were to start demanding that, how popular do you think it would have to be before you'd start taking it seriously?
Yeah, I don't think there's an exact answer to that, but I think the sort of things that you would need to be looking at would be whether a majority of people wanted a referendum, whether the referendum looked like it would be vaguely competitive. I mean, it would be preposterous to hold a referendum where you knew the result was going to be 97-3 or 94-6. I'm not sure exactly where that number is. 40%, 60-40, you're starting to get competitive. And signals through normal democratic processes that the advocates for that were doing very well. So something along the lines of Plaid Cymru advocating it and winning the most votes of any party in Wales, or the most seats, or winning an overall majority in the Welsh Assembly. It's not an exact scientific answer. I don't think there's an exact trigger, but those are the sort of things I'd expect to see. As it happens, Plaid Cymru have been nowhere near winning the largest number of votes in Wales. So I think for the moment, it's a moot point. I'd kind of put Wales as bubbling under, and I can't give you an exact trigger or finishing point that it would need to trigger. But those would be the sort of things I'd be looking for. That opinion polls were indicating the referendum would be competitive. Those advocating for a referendum or independence were doing well in and a range of elections, such that it would seem a bit preposterous not to grant the wish, and then they can decide. So, not a scientific answer there, Emma, but those are the sort of signposts that I would look for. So, I think it would be a bit odd, for example, in England, to hold a referendum on do you want English Home Rule, because clearly none of those signposts have been triggered at all, right? I mean, nowhere near. But were the English Democrats to top the poll in some England-wide election, well, I might reconsider that. Or if English people started saying one of my top 3 issues is home rule for England, then I think you've got to start considering it. And I would say that, generally speaking, defenders of the status quo probably do themselves no favours by being on the back foot a bit about this. I would think if you're a unionist, probably the best thing you can do is to have a referendum now and go and win it. I think this was a problem for the Remain side in the EU referendum. The sense was sort of do anything you possibly can to block a referendum for as long as possible. And I think that actually once these various points have been triggered that they're debatable against, hold it and win it. And if you can't get renewed and refreshed support for the status quo, then probably the status quo doesn't deserve to survive. So go on the front foot, put the case, and if you prevail, good on you.
Well, I mean, that's the suggestion, isn't it? That if Westminster continues to deny a second referendum to Scotland, actually it plays into the SNP's hands. We're getting a lot of comments in the YouTube chat, but if you want to form one of those into a question, do let me know. You've got probably 10 more minutes or so to put your questions to the Marcs here. Marc Glendening, do you think that more devolution, which is often proposed as a sort of stopgap to say, oh, well, we won't give Scotland a second referendum, we'll just give them a bit more devolution, a bit more power. Do you think that is a solution, or do you think it just pours fuel on the fire?
Well, I mean, how much more devolution can Scotland have without it becoming a separate state? It doesn't seem to me that there are too many more policy areas that can be devolved by definition if Britain wants to remain a nation state in any meaningful sense. What are they going to get? Foreign policy devolution? Are they going to get military devolution? I mean, what else is there? But I just wanted to come back on a point Marc made earlier, because he sort of implied, I was one of these people who had some sort of strange fetish for a blue-coloured passport, or this kind of stuff. And he's making, I think, a false dichotomy between emotions and the holding of serious values, because I don't think values are random. I think they are raw expressions of underlying, often subconscious values that we adhere to. And so what is dismissed by the kind of Guardianistas, of which I see or suspect, Marc as being part of the Hampstead kind of cultural elite, people who have emotionally held national values, whatever they are often dismissed as being sort of knuckle-dragging type creatures. And I think this is a wrong way of looking at the holding of emotions, which are by definition derived from values. And liberals at some point have to decide, which was, I think, one of the points I was trying to make earlier in the discussion before the technical problems. Liberalism exists in a sort of two parallel dimensions. On the one hand, it's an abstract philosophy and has to be. But of course, it also, to have any kind of impact on the real world, it has to also exist in the material constitutional context. It has to get its hands dirty politically. And ultimately, we as individuals who are liberals have to make a decision as to where we believe sovereign political power lies. And it seems to me then there are about
several tests which can be applied, which may not be satisfactory from a very intellectual, philosophical perspective, but nevertheless, those crude tests have to be applied when we decide which particular type of jurisdiction we want to be part of, whether it's the United Kingdom, an independent Scotland, a pan-European nation, or, the 51st state of the United States.
Marc Littlewood, what do you think about...
Yeah, I wanted to come back.
Feel free to come back. I was also just going to suggest, our colleague Philip Booth, who wrote a report on federal Britain, would suggest that more devolution is the answer. So I'd like your thoughts on that.
You've teed me up nicely. Sorry, I didn't need to cut across you there as the chair, Emma. That's exactly the point I was going to make. Mark Glendening is completely wrong about this. I mean, the devolved powers to the Scottish Parliament are pretty feeble, actually. And I would say if you, my advice to unionists would be if you want to save the union, read Philip Booth's paper, Federal Britain, and do that. So to give you an indication, I think virtually all taxation policy in Scotland should be run by the Scottish Parliament in Scotland. They should set the corporation tax rate, they should set the VAT rate, they should set the income tax rate. Not some sort of, you can dial up income tax by 1% here or 2% there. That's absolutely pathetic. I mean, that's local council levels of powers. The entire tax base of Scotland should be set by the Scottish Parliament. They might want to have higher income taxes and abolish VAT, or scrap corporation tax but have higher land taxes. The entire panoply of that should be in Scottish hands in a properly devolved system. The bits that you would keep, which Marc was sort of saying, foreign affairs, military, your embassies around the world, that's a very small part of government expenditure overall, and there would need to be some sort of precept of that. If the United Kingdom agrees that we need a United Kingdom nuclear deterrent, you need a way of charging for that. This is a very, very, very small part of the overall budget. So I actually think that unionists here, a bit like European unionists, need to wake up and smell the coffee a bit, that if you want to preserve the union, you're going to have to change it very, very radically. The EU completely failed to listen to the growing tide of Euroscepticism in general, but particularly in the United Kingdom. So when Cameron went to them cap in hand and said, look, I need some fundamental changes, what he came back with was absolutely feeble. The unionists and the European debate wouldn't really give an inch. And it seems to me a bit the same in the United Kingdom debate. If you want to lower the calls for independence and hold the UK together, give massive powers to the Scottish Parliament. Say that the only things that we'll keep, at a UK level, are, let's say, the currency, the monarchy, foreign affairs and defence. What you do with health, education, pensions, welfare, this is totally on you. Now, you'd obviously need a sort of transition and work out what the debts were and, who owed who what for public sector pension liabilities. You need an Excel spreadsheet to work it out, I grant you. But then it's completely up to them, completely up to the Scots. And if they want to spend a lot more on health and a lot less on education, or vice versa, or more on both and taxes to be higher, go for it. Go gangbusters for it. We haven't got anywhere close to proper devolution. And in my view, what the error from the unionist point of view strategically is you've created a parliament, therefore a rallying point, if you like, in Holyrood for people who want constitutional change, but you haven't really given it truly meaningful powers. So it's clearly more powerful than a local council, but it could have way, way, way more powers than it's been granted. And probably if you want to keep the union together, that would be a better strategy than sort of trying to hold off a referendum and then trying to win it by a whisker if it's sort of forced on you. So I would hope that unionists would read Philip Booth's excellent book and see that as a potential compromise and permanent solution. Even then it might not work and it might be too late, but I think that should at least be on the table.
I have one final question then before we wind up this evening. What do you think is the most persuasive argument that the other person has made? So we'll start with Marc Glendening. You say you were very emotional, unionist, but what do you think could be the one argument that may well persuade you to vote the other way, were you your imaginary Scottish floating voter?
Well, if the SNP, and this takes a huge leap of imagination, were to actually be a progressive Liberal Party that wanted to turn Scotland into the sort of the tartan tiger, then if I were something other than a dogmatic, emotional Glasgow Rangers supporting unionist, if I was a middle-of-the-road Scottish voter, I might find that an attractive vision of the future and a concrete reason as to why Scotland might potentially benefit from liberating itself from an excessively regulating and public spending United Kingdom. But of course, that is not the actual real world context. And while, Marc was rather bitchy and brutal in comparing me to George Osborne, which is obviously a horrible thing to be compared to, I don't think it's entirely, I'm not claiming to be Mystic Meg when I predict that the probability is Scotland will have, whether inside the UK or outside of it, at least another 20 to 30 years of centre-left, collectivist, high-spending government. And so the reality is, I think at the moment, there is no single argument I can see, unless you're a visceral Scottish nationalist, as to why Scotland, the ordinary people of Scotland who are not committed unionists or Scottish nationalists, should vote to leave the United Kingdom when it has a demos, it has a functioning democracy, it has a functioning economy, it provides relative security in terms of defence. Why on earth would a middle-of-the-road Scottish voter decide to ditch that, imperfect though it may be, for a future which is based upon a, reactionary, backward-looking vision which, Nicola Sturgeon and her friends epitomise?
Marc Littlewood, we will end with final comments from you. Has Marc Glendening managed to say one thing that persuaded you tonight, or are you as committed as you ever were?
I don't know what Glendening's most persuasive argument has been this evening, but that's certainly been his least persuasive argument. Scotland will only continue to have centre-left governments if that is where the median voter in Scotland is. So they're sort of, the median voter in Scotland's not going to want this centre-left government. Well, there won't be a centre-left government. There'll only be centre-left governments if the median voter is content with that. So I think that's nonsensical. And he's playing, from the Remainer handbook completely. I don't know why you tape a leap in the dark. It could all go horribly wrong for you. It's all right. The present situation's imperfect, but, it's not all of that bad, and you've got your security and you know where you stand. This is absolutely the Remainer playbook that Marc Glendening spent the bulk of his own political career arguing against. He's now picked up the Remainer playbook when it comes to this particular constitutional issue. But I would say I still think that probably is the most persuasive argument. And it nearly won for the Remain campaign over Brexit, that this is a leap in the dark. You can't be certain. Let me paint you a bleak vision of the future of a tyrannical SNP that can never be removed from office. That could happen to you. That could happen to you. That was very much the tropes that the Remain campaign ran in the Brexit referendum and nearly won. And I can understand why those weigh with the median voter. It's a leap in the dark going for independence and changing your constitutional status. That is a persuasive argument if you think that the status quo isn't too bad. Well, why spin the wheel? Why open the box? Just take the money rather than opening the box. And it will probably hinge on that. It will basically come down to the extent to which people feel confident in taking a risk or not. And the cautious, predictable, narrow the range of possible futures into something that's, might be mediocre, but at least that's guaranteed, that might yet win the day. And that I say that's probably the most persuasive argument that Marc's put forward. But it's not a particularly optimistic one, or one to get the heart beating, I would say. But I'm quite sure that that's the one that will be deployed.
Well, we'll see whether it is a leap in the dark or sticking with the status quo. Thanks very much to both Marcs for joining me this evening. I'm sure we'll be back the next time the IEA staff manage to find something to disagree with among themselves, which we do on an almost daily basis. Marc Littlewood will be back tomorrow night with Live with Littlewood from 6 p.m. Marc will be joined by Steve Baker MP, Calvin Robinson, Dominic Frisby and Kate Andrews to discuss policing, the ongoing vaccine rollout and the pending threat of inflation following the pandemic. It'll be live, as always, on the YouTube channel tomorrow night at 6 p.m. If you're after a reminder while you're here, click the subscribe button and you'll be notified about all the new content on the IEA London YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, and subscribe to the IEA podcast on Apple, Spotify or Podbean. Thanks again to all of the viewers for joining us tonight, and Marc Littlewood and Marc Glendening for participating. Thank you very much.